Appreciate you joining, Lilia. Would love to start off if you just talk a little bit about yourself, what you're up to, and why you got involved in the pro-democracy space in the first place.
Yeah, well, I'll start with that. The involvement was sort of unexpected, partially by way of just how client-centric work works. There was an opportunity that came our way, and the rest was sort of history. But my passion in this work lies from being a first-generation American. My parents, both of them immigrated from the former Soviet Union to the US, and in that certainly comes a whole sort of familial history of authoritarianism and communism and anti-Semitism and just about every ism out there. And so this work and this notion of making a real impact on people's lives is something that has been instilled in me since I was a little kid, which is why I got involved in politics at such an early age. But what I realized almost 15 years ago is the way that I wanted to do that was through communications because I think that it enables you to make the biggest impact the fastest and with the most amount of people all at once. I really enjoy direct one-on-one advocacy, but you would have to take a lot of meetings to really actually enact that impact, as opposed to things like mass communication or public relations or marketing. And so that kind of fast forward to where I am today, which is as of the last month or so, I'm looking at my calendar, being the founder and CEO of a communications consultancy called Emet Strategies. And Emet in Hebrew means truth, but it also has sort of deeper meanings of reliability, dependability, integrity. And those are all the things that I carry with me and look to carry forward in the work that I do.
Thanks for that overview and really interesting to get your personal experience and perspective. Before we dive into the pro-democracy space and its communication strategy, this is maybe a little bit of like a 30,000 foot question that may seem self-evident. But why do you think an effective communication strategy is so important for the pro-democracy ecosystem in the first place? I think I've been in a number of places where sometimes it'll be like communications is an afterthought or not
Mhm.
actually something that people are thinking about. So, like, why do you think that it's necessary for folks to be thinking about communications?
Yeah. Well, to give our space some credit, I don't think we're unique in that. Unfortunately, I can't go a day without looking on my LinkedIn feed and not seeing a CMO or a CCO of a large, private or public company say that they feel like communications is an afterthought. So we're not unique in that regard. But I think one of the reasons it's the most important for our fields is because as we are all in a variety of issue advocacy sub areas or sub industries, we cannot be effective without talking to the people. And we cannot, whether that is, sort of tried and true resistance and grassroots activation, whether it's asking people to participate in some sort of civic function, whether it is actually just trying to encourage civic engagement and education and participation, which is what a lot of our space does, you have to do that through efficient, smart, targeted communication. And I think on the flip side of that, and I think something that we often forget is that each one of us that works in this space is a consumer within our own right. We all have brands that we're affiliated with, and subscriptions we love, and newsletters we read, and social media platforms we are on. And I think that sometimes we have to sort of take a step back and realize that we are not employing the same types of tactics or communications tools that we ourselves consume. We are making assumptions based upon the audiences that we think we are trying to communicate with or we think we are trying to reach. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I think what it boils down to is the goal of this space is to make an impact, just like the impact that I'm trying to make as an individual. You cannot do that without effective communication. Doesn't matter if you're trying to pass a bill, protect an election official, make the world more peaceful, you can't do that without effective comms.
So on that point of we're not using the same communication strategies that we consume. Would love if you could dive into that a little bit more. What does that look like specifically? How do you see organizations maybe deploying tactics of old and why do you think that's happening?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the tactics of old, or I think the thing that aggravates me the most, which is PR for PR's sake.
Mm.
And credit to my old employer, but they used to say that quite a bit. We never do PR for PR's sake. And it's true. I mean, I cannot tell you the amount of times that effective communications for this space equals a certain amount of op-eds, equals a certain amount of media hits. And that's all wonderful. But the question that I always ask is for what purpose? Or what are you actually trying to do with it? I think where there is far more room, and just thinking of, for example, myself as a consumer, right? On a daily basis, I am consuming newsletters, podcasts, videos on YouTube. I'm looking at TikTok. I'm looking at Twitter, X, sorry. I'm looking at Instagram, on Facebook, on LinkedIn. I, as a consumer, and probably you and anybody else listening or watching, does the same thing. However, we are not showing up using those tactics and using those channels. I also think one of the things that we are completely overlooking is the way in which our industry, our issues that we care about, the policies that we advocate for, how their narratives and how their perceptions are being shaped by AI. Right now, if you go on Google and you look up who is Scott Warren or what is SNF Agora, you are going to get a Gemini populated answer, and you are probably going to stop there. But what we're not asking ourselves as an industry is how is Gemini or how are other AI platforms perceiving the work that we do? And is it accurate? And how can that actually be used by malign and foreign actors to completely change the perception of what we are trying to accomplish? So there's a lot of work to be done. And I certainly understand that investing into such an omni-channel strategy might not be for every organization, whether it's because it doesn't align with your mission or it doesn't align with your audience or whatever else. But the one thing that you cannot tell me in 2025 is you don't have the resources for it, because that is where AI can play a really meaningful difference for an organization that might just have two employees versus one that has 200.
Let's take a step back. I mean, you've done some writing on, included with me, but some writing recently too on um, still needing to up our comms game and thinking about what the pro-democracy sector is not getting right as it comes to communications. And so we've started this conversation sort of talking about the importance of it and how to use AI. I'd love if you can go a little bit deeper into like what's not working as you've worked with clients, as you see the sector, like what do you see as some of the challenges? We can get into maybe successes later on, but would love to hear you talk a little bit more about some that you've written on this.
Yeah. So I would say that there's two challenges, or maybe two things that aren't fully happening to the extent in which they are in other industries. The first, and all of this is from a communication standpoint, I'm not claiming to be a policy expert or a legal expert. I would say that the first is an appetite and level of comfort with testing and failing or testing and succeeding. It's just not happening as much as I think good communicators should be doing. And that ranges from everything that's basic to, oh gosh, what's my subject line and how am I going to run an A/B test, all the way through how am I testing certain creative campaigns against my target audiences? Or, how am I iterating on my strategy based off of the way that it's being received online or in the press or elsewhere? I think there's a large hesitancy to do so. And I think part of that reason, as much as I love our funders in this space, has to do with the safety or the sort of ability for funders to say it is okay if you fail You do not have to have the most bind up, perfect comms campaign, or we are not expecting to fund this like very tight comms budget, knowing that you're not going to test or knowing that that's not something we want to see. We need, as practitioners, more flexibility and more of that safety net to know that that is okay to do. That's the first thing. I think the second thing, something that I just touched on a few minutes ago, is this notion of we don't know who our audiences are. We make a lot of assumptions in this space about who we think they are, or where they are, or what they're reading, or how they're thinking, or what they're watching, but we don't have nearly the level of granularity about some of these audience-centric questions, the way that not only our peers and other nonprofit advocacy ecosystems do, but let alone our peers in the for-profit sectors do, and the way that they really drill down on individuals and personas based off of consumer habits, based off of geolocation, socioeconomic information, psychographics. We are just not doing that. I think part of that, again, is a resource question. And I also think part of it is because at so many organizations that I've worked with, you're looking for those quick hits, you're looking for those quick wins, let alone when you're in the middle of an election cycle and things are really intense and really crazy. As communicators, as senior strategists, we don't allow ourselves the time, or let alone a season in a year, to step back and do some of this work because it is time intensive and it does take a lot of concentration. And I think that if those two things can be done in lockstep, sort of this audience exploration and testing component, you will see this industry advance drastically because you're going to find communicators who now completely get who they're talking to, they get what moves them, and they're not afraid to try and figure out, are their assumptions right or are they wrong?
So on the audience point, I'm curious. Obviously, this probably looks different for different organizations, but so sometimes you hear this notion that that people don't really care about democracy, or the vast majority of people don't care about democracy, so it's going to be
Yeah.
bread and butter issues, and like that's what's motivating people. People don't. I mean, you sort of saw this played out in the election where you had sort of
Mhm.
Democrats try to make it around democracy. People didn't vote for that. And so when you think of the audience question, is it more of a niche? And again, this probably looks different for different organizations, but is it more niche? Are there organizations you think that can be talking to a greater public? Is it aspects of the public? And I'm sort of curious, sort of in that this which could be, I mean, it's something I think about a lot, but it could be sort of a wrong stipulation, but the stipulation that like the vast majority of the American people are not prioritizing democracy, how that fits into an audience segmentation question too.
Well, for starters, I think you're right. And I think exit polling and other polling shows that people don't care as much as we want them to. But I would also venture to say that insert consumer brand or insert some specific widget that any one of us use has also at one point in time faced that very same struggle. The difference is they've decided to really peel back the million layers of the onion to understand exactly whom they are trying to reach, and then they've tailored and crafted their messages in order to do so and in order to capture those people's attention. I think that we can get people more engaged and more receptive to a lot of the work in this space if we take on that approach. But also, a critical point of this is if we come to the table with the right kind of messaging and the right type of vision. Again, I say this with all due respect to so many of the people in the space that I've worked with or observed from afar. A lot of our messaging tends to be reactionary, responsive. It tends to be negative. It tends to be sort of in opposition to, as opposed to painting a picture of what could be, or painting a picture of what's possible, or how we are that shining city on a hill. I think that if we were to start coming to audiences who, frankly, don't give a hoot about any of the work that we are doing, let alone are probably not even turning out to vote. But we are coming to them with a message of here's why you matter, and here's why your city council matters, or here's why, if you want good roads or good schools or safe communities, here's how that is accomplished through so much of the work that our space does. That starts to completely change the footing that we've been on. So I think it's a problem that's sort of bifurcated. There's the do we actually know who we're talking to and what they want and what they care about, but also do we actually have the message to bring to them? And I think to your question of like, are there any organizations who are doing that or are not doing that well? Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to call them out here, but I think that there's far more learning to be done, even if this is not in an organization's clear charter or clear mission. We are still communicating, even if it's to bring, even if it's to elites or to academics or to the legal community or to others who might not be thought of as like traditional voters or traditional sort of regular folk. It's still the same problem and it's still the same equation that we can use to be more effective and get more validators, more champions, etc.
You want to segment, but I mean not lose control, but give some control up at some point. Going to the testing point, I'd love to hear a little bit more on like what that looks like or tests that you like what would it look like for an organization to be leaning into that? What are some examples that you've seen
Yeah.
of how organizations are testing different communication strategies right now?
So again, I think, as I said earlier, it can start with some of the basics, right? It can start with your good old-fashioned A/B testing. Does this
Mm.
subject line work? Does, one piece of creative outperform the other? Or, does my piece of content do better on LinkedIn than it does on X? And why is that, right? There's all these different ways to get to some like quick and dirty testing hits. I think where it becomes more challenging and it's almost hard to talk about at such an like abstract 30,000 foot level is when you start to test communications strategies or just larger communications tactics. By that I mean, am if I'm trying to reach audience A, do I come at them with let's say an aggressive digital marketing campaign that puts my brand and my messaging first? Or do I come at them with an aggressive micro influencer campaign from their communities that completely relinquishes my brand's messaging and my brand control and oversight? That's where it starts to get a little tricky, and you can certainly run into some trouble, don't get me wrong, let alone, again, with every test comes wasted time and a little bit of wasted resources. But like I said, it's a little difficult to talk about at an abstract level without having a direct example to give or to show. The one thing that I will caution is that also means, again, just from an internal expectation management perspective, you and your leaders have to, and maybe your funders and your board have to buy into this notion that you may waste time and you may waste resources. And maybe you're going to get your brand into an audience who has never been exposed to that. And maybe that's going to get you in a little bit of hot water. All of those things, though, can be planned for and can be mitigated. So I think it's really about a combination of ensuring that there's appropriate resources and operations and, capabilities to do that work. It's just as important as actually doing the testing itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I think that's a good plug to funders, organizations, and the like. This is, I think bringing in the audience segmentation and the testing to some extent. One thing that sometimes does concern me, I'm just sort of like litanying out my like concerns, thoughts on communications, and you can try to wrestle with them. Just the internal groupthink of the pro-democracy sector writ large and how that plays in with communications too. So let me just like one, I think this does go to audience segmentation, but I think that there's sometimes this like worry that even thinking like pre 2024 election, there was all this focus on um how do we get Americans to trust elections? A lot of organizations putting together talking points. Great.
Mm.
I had some concern, I don't know if this played out or not, that it was organizations sending each other talking points and then complimenting each other on the talking
Yeah.
points that were then circulating amongst each other. That may or may not be right, but I guess I guess the question is, I mean, how worried are you about some of that group thing, but how do we get past that group thing? Because there's this part of me that's almost like one of the things that might need to happen from a communications perspective is like, I mean, you're making the point of tying democracy to other issues, which I think makes sense, but there's almost like a how does the sector get outside of its own way on some of this too? So I'd be curious to get your reactions and reflections there.
I self-identify as somebody who wrote a lot of those talking points and
Well, I don't mean
distributed a
to.
lot of them, but no, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's something that I, Lord knows, have complained about myself. The obvious answer is, well, let's just get more messengers and, let's just increase our digital budgets and get our message out elsewhere and not just within our own ecosystem. Those are obvious things and certainly far more nuanced than the way that I'm putting it. But I think you just hit home on something that I've certainly been passionate about for the last several years, which is there's so much work on a daily basis for any practitioner or funder in this space to be doing things that are on their plate, ways to keep up with the industry, policies that they're watching, litigation that they're involved in, comms tactics that they need to get out the door, deliverables, right? Like these things just stack up when you're a professional in this industry. I think the one thing that we do not do effectively, and I haven't seen this in a lot of varying roles throughout this industry, is look outside of the democracy ecosystem. I think that there's not enough time to learn from others. There aren't really structures in place that allow us to do that. When I think of other for-profit industries that I've served in the past, there's always been some sort of an association or some sort of, critical um, industry news function that's been filled. And a lot of what those organizations do, aside from, publicly advocating on behalf of their industry, is also working to upskill and train and educate those within the industry itself. As a democracy ecosystem, we don't really have that. The closest we get to that is democracy notes, thanks to Gabe and the work that he's doing. But even so, he's just one person, and I think he's recently reached 9,000-ish subscribers, but there's tens of thousands of people that work in this space. So I suppose what I'm advocating for is for organizations to A, be curious and just think a little bit, from day to day, like, oh, if I'm doing this one communication strategy, I wonder how somebody in the climate space is doing this. Or I wonder if, how my favorite brand might be handling this issue or what they're doing recently. I think two is also encouraging leaders within organizations, chief ops officers, human resources, CEOs, executive directors, whatever else, to find opportunities to bring external speakers to team meetings, retreats, staff functions, etc. We love a good motivational speaker, and we love somebody from within the space who, can come in and talk to us about all the amazing work that's being done. But let's look outside because I think that's really the only way that we learn and grow. And to be honest with you, Scott, that's actually been one of my biggest fears in going out on my own is, I've been in an agency setting for 8, 9 years. And when you're in that environment, you constantly learn and grow from your colleagues, your bosses, your clients, because everyone's working on a different industry and everyone's, doing things somehow in a different way. Going out on my own, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot because now it's just me in my own little bubble with my own little clients. And so I've even been thinking of, do I join the, Public Relations Society of America or the Public Affairs Council or all these other professional organizations that are out there? I'd love to see our space think about professional development in that way too.
Appreciate, and I mean, no, I mean, good take on just the how that can be switched into to the morale side of things too. Maybe on that point, I'd love to, whether it's specific org, specific campaign, specific strategies, hear a little bit on like what are you hopeful about? What do you see working? What do you see pivoting right now? So we focus a lot on what's not working, but would love to hear a little bit on the, what do you see as some bright spots right now?
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I think there are organizations who very rightfully took the better part of this year to stop, evaluate, question, understand what happened, or sort of why their outcomes were what they were. Um, and for that, like, I commend practitioners and funders for engaging in those exercises. I also think that we're at a really interesting point in the year and sort of like the 2 year election cycle where as we get out of summer and as we get into fall, things are going to start to pick up and there's going to be more movement. And I'm really looking forward to seeing which organizations, big or small in the space, take the torch and really run with the experimentation, the bold campaign ideas, going directly to consumer, directly to voter. Because I think to some extent, a lot of the work that I've seen over the last 7 months has sort of been more of what we saw over the last year or so. But I've talked to communicators and I've talked to practitioners who have assured me that come September, October, their organizations are ready to sort of make this pivot. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for. Um, I also think that there's a lot of really, again, I hate to keep plugging Bill Gates, but there's a lot of really great work that is going to be coming out of higher education institutions and partners, ASU, Hopkins, MIT and others. And so I think that there's going to be just additional resources that are more friendly toward practitioners and not so academic and research heavy, although there's a time and a place for all of that, don't get me wrong, but just things that are easily applicable and accessible for those of us who are trying to kind of get the work done day in and day out. So those are some of the things that are kind of giving me hope at the moment. And we'll see. We'll see what happens over the next couple of months. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, it is. I think that it is an interesting uh, pivot point. I guess maybe one last question from me, and if you have anything else to add, I'm struck by this, what you were saying about um, morale.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's an important part of communications that folks probably don't think about as much when it does, not even from a partisan perspective, but like it's such a challenging moment for the democracy ecosystem. This balance of like how much are you on the defensive, how much are you doom and gloom versus also not being out of touch with what's happening, but also making sure that people don't get discouraged internally or externally. And I'm
Mhm.
curious, like, what you see as the role of communications in that,
Yeah.
in making sure that people don't feel discouraged and disenchanted in a hard moment.
I mean, again, I think for so many different reasons that you just pointed out, we are not agnostic in that worldview or in that experience. Like there are other industries who are facing certainly like dark times and are making it through. So look, what I would say is I think what is most important during this period of time is as organizational leaders, again, here I'm talking about executive directors, COOs, CEOs, presidents, etc., for them to be able to set a positive vision and a positive direction for their organizations. Communicators are meant to be the glue. Like we are meant to be the ones who are seamlessly communicating internally and externally. And oftentimes, what I found is, particularly in a lot of the work that we do, that internal comms component gets lost pretty quickly. And I think there's tremendous value in that. There was somebody that I was talking to as I was figuring out sort of my next steps as a professional in between my roles. And one of the things that he said to me, he's a chief marketing officer at a very large, very well-known consumer brand that I won't mention. And, he oversees, him and his CEO oversee tens of thousands of people. And he said on any given day, when 10,000 people are marching in the same direction, it is the most beautiful, phenomenal thing you can see. And as a communicator, you have a lot to do with that. You have a lot with how you set the tone for the organization, the way you uphold its mission, vision, and values every single day. But when those 10,000 people are going 10,000 different directions, as a communicator, that's going to be your worst day on the job. And it's part of your responsibility to figure out how to get those individuals back on track. So I guess what I would say is, again, to those organizational leaders, don't forget that comms has a role at the table. Don't forget that just as much as you're investing and communicating to your external partners, stakeholders, board members, funders, et cetera, you've got a workforce and you've got employees who are also currently going through it and need just as much attention to the culture that you're cultivating, the way you live those mission, vision, and values every single day. And you're going to have a great communicator by your side to ensure that that's being carried out appropriately internally. And of course, ideally an HR person or two. But I really do think that that's we can't oversee that because I know the burnout is very real and it's probably not going to get any easier over the next several years. So we really have to ensure that we're supporting our workforce.
No, I think that that's well said and really important to be thinking about. Anything else I didn't ask that you want to mention or go over?
I would just, I think like the one thing that I would challenge everybody to is, again, critically evaluate the news that you are consuming each morning or each evening before you go to bed. I went from getting probably like two, 3 dozen all political, all like, breaking news of the day newsletters in my inbox and being extremely overwhelmed to the point where I just like wasn't reading any of them. Um, to now very carefully curating newsletters that expose me to new ideas, expose me to new industries, expose me to new thoughts. And that has drastically changed the way that I start my day and how I end my day because I'm consuming information that most of the time has actually nothing to do with what I'm working on any given day. And I think that it is super important, no matter what role you play in our industry, to continue to expose yourself. And also, it's just a great way to get out of the rut of the day-to-day BS that we have to read and deal with. So that really is just kind of the one thing that I would challenge everybody to is to just think critically about what you're consuming and find a way to learn something new every day.
Do you have any specific suggestions of newsletters or news to?
I have to plug Axios Communicators. It is truly phenomenal. Eleanor Hawkins does the Lord's work from a media journalist perspective. Um, I also think that one of the newsletters I found really helpful is I think it's Philanthropy Today. I'm probably butchering it. But it's from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And the reason for that is because they do cover so many other for-profit sectors and talk about so many different types of philanthropic news and campaigns and successes that it really sort of helps open my eyes to what's possible. So those are the two that I religiously read every morning or afternoon.
Cool. I actually don't get those, so I will check it out.
Ah,
Yeah, that's a good. I'm probably too in the news of it all. Great. Well, appreciate you taking the time.
yeah, thank you. This has been great.